Thanks, Becky. Thanks. Well, thank you, Lieutenant Governor Clayfish, and I want to thank, first off, the panel, particularly Amber and her dad, for being here. We're going to hear from them in a minute. I want to thank the Sheriff's Department as well as the District Attorney's Office. In a minute, I'm going to introduce Ed Wall is going to tell us a little bit about the Department of Justice. I want to thank all of you coming, and one of my former colleagues, Dan Brackus. I appreciate him being here on behalf of the county and the lawmakers who are here. This is really, as Becky mentioned, important for a variety of reasons, but none more personal than all of us who are parents. My two sons are a little bit older than the Clayfish girls, but I've got two nieces. One is going to be in second grade out here in Waukesha, goes to school in the public schools here in Waukesha. Another who's going to start kindergarten this next fall. My two kids go to Wauwatosa East, junior and senior, at Wauwatosa East High School, and I know all throughout the spectrum, a lot of times you saw the video appropriately looking at getting the message out to young kids right off the bat, but it's something that when my kids were that age, we spent a lot of time honing in on making sure we were following all the right tips. We were putting the computer in an open area. We tried to monitor what they were looking at on the internet. We tried to look at all those things, and we still continue to do that. We've got, not only from me, but other friends of mine, my kids, to make sure we know what's on Facebook and Twitter and things of that nature. But in the end, increasingly, there are more and more outlets. The idea that you can just have it be self-contained, watching the PC in your own house is not enough, because as kids get older, with teenagers like our kids, you know, they've got phones and iPads and everything else, and it's just more ways, more access points. And it's one of those we can't take it for granted. And so that's part of the reason why we're here today. In particular, one of the things we wanted to highlight, and Ed's going to talk a little bit about, is something that is important to be aware of, important to work the connections with. Didn't get a lot of attention in the budget process, mainly because it's not controversial. It's something that Democrats and Republicans have supported. Again, I appreciate the lawmakers who are here who voted for it in the budget. We started out about a dozen years ago, when Jim DeWall was the Attorney General, started out with the Wisconsin's own Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force. It grew over time. Each of the last few years it's grown because the problem's grown. And in this budget, early on when J.B. Van Hollen, our Attorney General, came in and talked to me, he talked about what his priorities were for this budget. And he said, in this case, it's not enough not only to sustain it. This is one where we have a growing problem. We need to help assist local governments, sheriff's departments, police departments, district attorneys' offices, law enforcement across the state, as well as schools and community groups and other leaders in each of our respective communities. And so he made a request. We included it in the budget, and thankfully it made it all the way through. So now, instead of the 22 positions that were previously involved with the task force, we'll now go up to 30 in this budget. 8 additional positions this year. It goes up 11 the following year, because it makes up for 3 positions that were funded a couple of years ago with federal funds. Those federal funds expire next fiscal year, and so we think it's that important to stabilize the positions at 30, even without the federal funding in those 3 key categories. So for us, this is tremendously important, and what we find is this alone is not going to stop the growing problem of predators seeking to prey on our young people in the state, but it will be a big help. And of course, here in southeastern Wisconsin, an example amongst many, but a high-profile example that many of us probably saw in the last few years, was when the former mayor of the city of Racine was apprehended, seeking to make contact with who he thought was a minor at that time. That involved both the city of Racine and the jurisdiction of Brookfield, where he was seeking to make contact, as well as working with the Department of Justice and other individuals. That's the kind of expertise, that's the kind of value that this task force brings to the table in terms of bringing people together. It's the sort of thing, we were just in Green Bay and La Crosse earlier, and no one jurisdiction has enough resources to cover this all on their own. So to have that collectively through this task force is a tremendous advantage. The other key thing, and I can't stress this enough, again, part of the reason why we're here today talking about this publicly, is the best way for us to deal with this problem is to take and use tips and information up front early, so that the folks who have great expertise in this field can do what happened in that case with the former mayor of Racine, and that is make an apprehension before a crime has been committed. obviously, we're going to aggressively work with prosecutors and with local law enforcement to prosecute individuals who have committed crimes where there's a victim involved, and appropriately so. But ideally, the more we get information out, the more we make particularly parents, educators, people involved with the Boys and Girls Club and Scouts and other groups out there that work with kids day in and day out, the more they're aware of what's going on and the growing concerns that are out there, the more likely this task force can help law enforcement follow up on those tips and apprehend individuals involved with this kind of predatory action long before they actually get to a victim. And that's really what we're hoping for, drawing attention to this. So I appreciate the leadership of J.B. Van Hollen, the Department of Justice. I'm now going to turn it over to Ed Wall, who's got an extensive background in law enforcement. Started out in the police force in Connecticut, moved to the State Patrol in New Hampshire, was drawn through his wife actually back to Wisconsin, which we appreciate her bringing it back to her roots because he was involved as a special agent in the Department of Justice, has had a multitude of positions, and up until last spring was the head of emergency management for the state of Wisconsin. J.B. Van Hollen was successful in bringing him back home to the Department of Justice, and he's now the administrator of the Division of Criminal Investigation, DCI, for the state of Wisconsin. And he and the team that's a part of this task force continues to do a great job, and we know with these additional resources, he's going to do an even better job in protecting our kids. So with that, Ed?
I know a lot of the parents, they don't know what the kids are doing, and if they're not really hooked up to the media or news, they really don't understand what's going on. And so how can we make that awareness level higher for the general public?
Sure. Numbers could barely answer this, but a couple things. One, it's part of the reason why we're doing this at several sites around the state today was to hone in on this. Again, not controversial. Some Republicans and Democrats supported. Media-wise, it's good to hone in on it. A lot of times in the Capitol, all they talk about are things that are controversial. This is something that's not, but it deserves as much or more attention than anything else out there because it's so important to kids. Secondly, but part of the reason why staffing up, so we go from 22 up to 30, is so important, why the Attorney General really stressed this and we took it and ran with it, was it's not just for prosecution. Certainly part of this is, as long as you got predators out there, we've got to work with prosecutors and others around the state, but it's also about the compounding impact, the multiplier that Ed talked about, of where we're training partners to help us get the message out in schools, amongst parents groups, amongst groups like the Boys and Girls Club and other groups that have access to kids, where not only to the kids but to family members that message can be passed on. The other thing, and I think it's important for the other question too, about really two key things, again, as a parent to think about. Certainly it's the person from the outside coming in, the perpetrator that you don't know, that may appear, as the Lieutenant Governor talked about, someone who portrayed themselves as a family, and then you come up and it's not a family at all. But the other thing to remember, and this is a little bit more challenging, is it's also, in some cases, as Amber talked about, it's someone you might know. And we've talked about this before, where kind of the grooming, this is one of those where as parents and as others around kids have to be asking and working in ways that we never dreamed of. The district attorney's right. I would have never, without being involved with this, some of the things you think about, you'd never dream them. You just can't. You say, okay, I did all the right things. I watch what my kids are doing on the internet. Well, I'm doing all the right things. Well, there might be someone who's now texting and you're not thinking about it because you're thinking they're only texting all their other buddies. Well, who knows who's coming in on that? So this is one where it's a greater challenge than ever before for parents to stay on top of things. But again, having more resources to help us out and get that message out, I think, is more and more step in the right direction.
At this point, we'll open it up to anyone with a question. All right, very good.
Sorry, can I hear one? What would be your direct message, Governor, to these predators out there, looking them right in the eye? What is your message to them?
Who is it to?
Your message to these predators out there.
Well, I think the clear message is this task force has aggressively worked with local law enforcement to track individuals like this down. They now have more resources. They're compounding those resources. And the bottom line is, because of that, they're going to find a way to track individuals down. So it is amazing to me that there's anybody out there, after Brad mentioned Dateline, but after seeing stories like that, I can't imagine whether it was nationally or even some of the local stations have done stories like that, that people would even fathom, set aside the moral element, just the logic of it. But there are people who in many cases are sick and deranged, and so we need to make sure that law enforcement has the tools, and they now have even more tools to crack down on even more folks. They're going to compound that, and in the end, we're going to stop this.
Thank you.
All right, who's got the first question?
Can you address concealed carry?
What's that?
Can you address the concealed carry bill?
Yeah. Well, thankfully, we asked for a measure that had both a permitting process and education training requirement in. That'll make us one of the safer states with concealed carry. We'll now be the 49th state, so only Illinois doesn't have that. And I think the fact that we've got a good training requirement makes it a good, solid bill.
I'll ask you again, actually, just talking
Yeah.
about today.
Yeah.
What would you say to the people out there that, are engaging in this behavior and just haven't been caught yet?
Well, we are united. This is an issue that Democrats, Republicans come together on. We're working with the Attorney General. We've given the Justice Department the resources to come on out and say, if people are engaged in this sort of activity, the state of Wisconsin is going to hunt them down. Local law enforcement is our partners, and we're going to put them away. And their days are numbered.
How important is Amber and other victims coming forward?
Well, I think it is helpful because part of this process isn't just having resources. It's not just about law enforcement. It's about people being more attentive. They can have all the resources in the world, but if we don't have people out in the community giving us tips, giving us information, that's really where the leads come from. And the more we can get that information out, the better. But I think when Amber or any other victim comes forward, that sends a powerful message about how real this is. And as she mentioned, particularly if we have amongst teenagers and school-age kids, people like her talking to them, that gets their attention more than me as a parent or anybody else can. Letting people know that you can do all the right things and yet be drawn into this, and that's just how cautious you have to be. The internet's a wonderful thing. It's great for education. It's great for research. It's great for entertainment, but it's also going to be a very dangerous tool in the wrong hands.
You talked about how the breadth of these crimes grows every single year. Why does that keep growing like that? And is there any way to stop it from growing?
Well, I think as you see, and again, on the positive side, as you see the growth of electronic media, not just on the internet, but with Twitter and Facebook and all these other sites, you see more and more positive things out of that, more communications, more dialogue, but it also gives predators, potential predators, more access points to teens and other vulnerable citizens out there. And so as things grow and there's more outlets, particularly in many cases for whatever reason, people feel that there's greater anonymity. Although, as the task force team would tell you, it is actually easier in some ways for them to track down predators. In the past, one of the earliest indicators local law enforcement and the task force told us was people possessing child pornography. As the district attorney mentioned, it was very difficult to access that and find out people who were doing that in the past. Now, there's plenty of ways that they can tap into that. That's the early stage. If they get those folks early, prosecute them, keep them out of harm's way, they're that much better off. But with multiple outlets, it is difficult to track all those down. That's why these resources are so important.
Why now, I guess? Why are we committing this money now? Is this something that we're going to continue to do in years to come?
Absolutely. We go from 22 to 30 spots. It was mainly J.B. Van Hollen came to me and said, we've been effective at this. This is a great task force. It's a great tool. We've continued to add resources to it. But he said, as successful as we are, we find in doing that, we find more and more potential predators out there. They came in and said this would help us tremendously. It would help not only for the work they do directly, but it would help compound that impact around the state. So whether it's Waukesha or La Crosse or Green Bay or any other community across the state, we're helping those communities help themselves in this effort. And for us, as long as we see it being successful, we're going to continue to give it support.
Continued increased support?
Yeah, for the next 2 years, it goes from 8 positions this year to 11 more next year, mainly because that federal funding coming out. And if we continue to be successful, we'll look at expanding in the future.
Thank you, sir.
Great. Thanks.